one of the reasons I'm so incredibly excited about Gen AI is it allows you to interrogate unstructured data and use that for interesting things from an analytics standpoint, or to widen the happy path and use that to drive automation.
Hello, world. Welcome to AI Confidential, the podcast about AI and how to benefit from it responsibly. I'm Aaron Fulkerson, the CEO of Opaque.
And I'm Mark Hinkle, the founding publisher of the Artificially Intelligent Enterprise.
Mark, today we're sharing a conversation I had with James Kaplan, the CTO of McKinsey and Company's enterprise technology practice.
Oh, that sounds cool. Tell me
Why
about...
couldn't you make it, Mark? Why weren't you there?
I was actually listening to OpenAI's chief economist in the booming AI hub of Durham, North Carolina. It is Raleigh-Durham Startup Week. And Ronnie Chatterjee from Duke, he's a Duke professor, and he is the... I don't know if he was 100% serious, but he said he was the oldest employee at OpenAI. And he didn't look that old, but it was interesting because he's he was the guy who actually authored the U.S. CHIPS Act, and now he is working at OpenAI and traveling around the world.
So James Kaplan, back to James Kaplan. McKinsey and Company is one of these companies that has had a huge outsized impact on business globally. They've consulted with the largest enterprises and organizations, and they also produce incredibly good research.
I know. I'm quite the fanboy of their infographics. I think they're very, very good at making complex concepts easy to understand.
Yeah, their reports are always like really densely packed. They're concise and pack a lot of value into them. They're just really good at it. So when I met James and he mentioned that they have this foundational AI research project going on, I was like, hey, what are you seeing so far? He shared some information about what they were seeing that was pretty exciting. And immediately I was like, you got to come out to the AI salon that we're doing in New York, the Tech Leaders AI Salon, and be one of the anchor speakers to get the conversation started, and immediately invited him to join the podcast too.
You've mentioned salon. It's at different times. What are your salon events like? I'm just curious as an event organizer.
Opaque's mission is to drive human progress by helping organizations responsibly adopt AI. So keeping with that mission, we organize, typically it's like every quarter, a salon. It's for technology leaders. It's mostly in the enterprise that we, just because that's my network. And they come together to share best practices around AI adoption and how to drive value from adopting AI. It generally is heads of engineering teams, CTOs, CIOs, CTOs, and often it's high tech or banking, financial services, insurance. That tends to be who's attending. We host them in San Francisco, and the next one's in New York. And then the structure, like the salon, what we try to do is, instead of it being a talking head, like group of people who get up and talk, we want it to be more of a birds of feather collaboration where people are peers coming together, sharing best practices. But to break the ice, what we do is we'll have a speaker of notoriety. So Ray Luca, who's a founder of Opaque and a nerd famous researcher of AI and security, or the one in New York we did, will be James. We'll do like a setup with 15 minutes of question and answer, open it up to the audience, and then it's a plated dinner, and everybody's like, it's much more collaborative rather than a talking head.
I like it.
Before we jump into the interview with James, we're going to give you a quick update on AI developments that we're most excited about right now. Mark, what's your AI in context?
So this week I was fascinated. I'm by Toby Lutke is the founder and CEO of Shopify, and he he put out this. I don't mean this in a pejorative way, but he put out this edict that said that everyone at Shopify should be using AI before they ask for headcount, using AI before they ask for resources to see. It's his terminology was a little different. He called it reflexive AI, but I just think it's an AI first mindset, which I think is what every organization should be thinking about is when they have an IT component of their business is what is the AI role in this new project? Is it something that can be handled by AI? And I guess there's two sort of parts to that. There's one part where I think we're over rotated on efficiency right now, and we're under rotated on opportunity of AI. So a lot of folks are worried about can we do this with less people? And I think it's about the opportunity cost is can you do more with less people? And that doesn't mean reducing. It just means can I get 3 times the productivity from an individual to launch a new product to, rather than Klarna is sort of one of these lighthouse success stories where they, I think, replaced 700 customer service reps with chatbots, and they're able to handle 2.3 million inquiries with chatbots. But the part of the story that I think is missing is, did that improve customer satisfaction? Were they able to do 2.3 million before? Or did people get frustrated and, hang up on their call center or no, I get super frustrated with chatbots that are run by people because one of my first gigs was running call centers. And, anytime that you're context switching from email to phone, or in this case, chat to chat, it's just not as good. So I really think that it's interesting that Shopify is putting a stake in the ground and saying, no matter what we do, we're going to think about AI. And he even pointed to where he used he used agents to create his keynote, I think, at the company meeting, which I'd like to see because that is one of the weaker use cases from my experience is to create PowerPoints that aren't, it's good at creating your thoughts, but it's not very good at creating PowerPoints. So there was a link in his company memo that probably linked to the company internet. I was really excited to see what he was doing, and maybe he'll repost it on Twitter or X.
Yeah, it's not great at PowerPoints yet. I expect that it will be. We've talked about it. It's about having a collaborator. I use it as a collaborator to help me organize my thoughts. Some people are like me. I work best when I have somebody to bounce ideas off of and collaborate with. And that's been the biggest boon from AI for me. I'll tell you, I get frustrated when I hear people like proudly proclaiming how, no, I don't use that AI stuff. And it's like, you should.
Yeah. It's like,
I need you to. You need to do that.
It's like saying, I don't believe in indoor plumbing. I dug a hole in my backyard. Yeah. That's not a badge of honor. That is just.
Yeah. If you had, you would have prepared me better for this call.
Yes.
Yes. I completely get where he's coming from.
Yeah. I think that it's, the nuance that people are worried about is that they don't have value in the age of AI. And the nuance that I think they're missing is that by taking away the things that don't add value, the value that they add is now amplified. So, there's no way that I could write better meeting notes than my AI note taker. And I've tried to do that, and then I get frustrated. It does a great job. And I have tried multiple ones. I have one I like and one I'm trying out because it integrates with my email. Um, but that's not a badge of honor. If I'm not focused on taking good notes, I can actually be present for the conversations.
Yeah, your AI in context central point is be an AI first player or person or employee and I apply that to conversations I have like literally in my neighborhood with people who are in real estate. I have had conversations where they're telling me, "Oh, I've got to do this." I'm like, "Hey, aren't you using ChatGPT?" And they're like, or Claude, or they're like, "What's that?" So they've probably heard of ChatGPT. And then I'm like, you should use Claude for what you're describing because it's writing. And I tell them today, go put in this prompt, what you're trying to achieve today. And I promise you, you will immediately buy a subscription. And then I'll see them a couple of days later, like, I can't believe it. That's amazing. And then I see them a couple of weeks later and they're like, I use it pretty much every day.
Yeah.
My AI in context would have to be the new Llama 4 model, which is just really about efficiency. I think that the fact that they've got um, this new model family, which increases the efficiency of inferencing, I think is pretty exciting. And you were sharing something about the Hugging Face LLM Arena or something.
Yes, the conspiracy, because everybody loves a good conspiracy. So part of the, LLM arena is works by people, you know, rating the responses they get from models. So human beings rating it. Um, there's a couple of things that I've read online. One is they were saying that for certain use cases, so that they would run high in the empirical rankings, that Llama was tuned for that. And the other is that for the LLM arena, that there are bots that are actually approving responses even when they are terrible to, crank up the ratings, which I have no firsthand knowledge, but it's very interesting that I did play around with it a little bit and I was like, it's pretty good. But the problem is that when you start with a new model, when you're used to using ChatGPT and it has memory, it's pretty good because you've given it a more context. You go to Hugging Face, and for those of you that think we're talking about emojis, Hugging Face is the sort of the GitHub for LLMs, and you can type in there and apply your prompts to a model, but without the memory, it may not give you as good an answer because of that, and not because you would have to take something that is not influenced by the memory you have in ChatGPT or Google Gemini or Claude to compare. So I think it's a hard apples to apples comparison any longer.
I mean, it makes sense that it would be in model developers' best interest to game the arena. Yeah, I think your point that resonates with me, Mark, is that AI shouldn't be thought of as a way of automating things so that you can do less or fire people. It should be looked at a way of improving your quality of life and the quality of your work product. And I've experienced that myself. And then my AI in context that for this week is really my excitement over in the increased efficiency and inferencing in models, evidenced most recently by the Llama 4 model family.
Okay, yeah, I'm anxious to hear what you and James had to say. So let's start that.
Today, I'm joined by James Kaplan, CTO of McKinsey and Company's Enterprise Technology Practice. James, welcome to the AI Confidential podcast. It is a delight to have you. Thank you so much for joining me.
I'm thrilled to be here.
So, for our listeners who might not know you or bizarrely not know McKinsey, Would you give us a quick summary of first start with McKinsey and then your background and what you do there?
We like to say that McKinsey is the world's preeminent management consulting firm. We help major institutions solve their most challenging and most important problems. And I've been at McKinsey for, terrifying as it is, to think about 25 years. I was much younger when I joined.
Great. Well, go into some of the details of you as CTO.
Yeah, I'll tell you a little bit about my background. So many years ago, I joined what used to be known as the Business Technology Office, which was our practice for serving CIOs and other executives on how enterprises use technology and get value from technology. And then, not about 2010, I founded our cybersecurity practice because I had heard from many of our CIO and CTO clients how personally worried they were about cybersecurity. They were worried about showing up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. They were worried about how to make tough decisions, trading off things like risk and innovation and cost. Then I was heavily involved in creating our cloud practice, which grew out of our IT infrastructure practice. And now currently I lead our technology relationship with a bunch of big institutions doing exciting things like technology strategy and operating model and technology innovation and so forth. And as chief technology officer of what's now called McKinsey Technology, that's our enterprise technology practice, the practice that serves CIOs and CTOs on how to get the most value for enterprises from technology. I lead a lot of our innovation and a lot of our research and our publishing. So I've been spending a lot of time thinking about how we build things like Gen AI and knowledge graphs into the way that we serve clients. I think that'll be transformative for professional services. And a lot of our thinking about how Gen AI and things like Gen AI will reshape enterprise technology at many large institutions. We have a big report, tentatively titled "The Future of Enterprise Technology," which will come out in the fall. And I'd love to tell you a little bit more about that today.
Yeah, I'd love to hear more about it. And you're currently in Manhattan, correct?
That is correct.
So
Um,
we might hear sirens, which I'm in San Diego. James is in Manhattan.
so we're going to hear waves. We're going to hear like sea lions, things like
Dolphins.
that. You have
You're going to hear
dolphins.
dolphins chirping in the
Yeah, like
background.
like
Yeah,
the people who came back to Earth in the SpaceX capsule where they were greeted by dolphins.
yeah, that's
Okay,
exactly right.
okay, that would be an exciting podcast if we had dolphins.
So
Yeah,
this research that you've been conducting at McKinsey, which obviously McKinsey is just famous for exceptional research that helps organizations and businesses transform their practices. I'm really excited to hear some of the preliminary work that you've done, but I'll ask the dumb question. Why this research on generative AI in the enterprise?
well, it's Gen AI plus, so it's around a broad set of things, inclusive of Gen AI, in which Gen AI
So
may be
so
the
AI, so
biggest thing.
analytics,
Yeah,
ML, and
and
Gen
analytics,
AI.
knowledge
Yeah.
graphs, the impact of geopolitical risk on enterprise technology, which is not small. And I would say, with a lot of our research, at least I personally aspire to solve what I describe as the airport billboard problem, which is the CEO or the CFO is walking through LaGuardia Airport or JFK Airport, and there's some billboard there in the airport that says, gee, you will be all in the cloud within 72 hours, right? Or you don't need an IT organization, or some just some very provocative statement, which is not necessarily grounded in reality. And what we're trying to do is really figure out what the art of the possible and the direction of travel is. And one of the things that, is I think special about McKinsey is our ability to connect with a large number of executives at a large number of important institutions. So we're grounding this research, and among other things, pretty deep interviews we're going to do with technology executives at probably 80 to 100 different institutions would be the aspiration.
How is AI changing the enterprise technology landscape? What are you seeing so far?
I would separate that question to two parts: AI and Gen AI. And I tend to think Gen AI is a lot bigger than potentially than what we've seen from AI to date, which is to say, AI depends on a massive amount of structured data, credit card transactions, sort of consumer auto insurance inquiries, what have you. And obviously, in many domains, AI has been fantastic, or traditional AI has been fantastically impactful. Next product to buy, customer retention in consumer markets, things like that, because we have massive amounts of data to transact on. However, for most corporations, in most of their businesses and most of their functions, there's more unstructured data, or more important unstructured data, than there is structured data or transactional data. And one of the reasons I'm so incredibly excited about Gen AI is it allows you to interrogate unstructured data and use that for interesting things from an analytics standpoint, or to widen the happy path in terms of automation. Let's think about a multi-line financial institution. There's a whole bunch of banks that have managed to automate the provision of a credit card. You get online, you enter your information, it does some analytics to figure out what interest rate you get, and a credit card comes to you in the mail. There is no bank, to my knowledge, anywhere that's managed to automate or even come close to automating, you know, a prime services for a hedge fund. That still involves emailing documents back and forth, right? Because the happy path is very narrow, right? There's too many different documents and too many different variations. And one of the exciting things about Gen AI is it can interrogate customer data and use that to drive automation. Now, how far along are we with Gen AI? It's still incredibly early days for what I think will be a fairly transformative change in what enterprise technology does and how enterprise technology gets done. And those actually will be two different things, I would suggest to you.
Yeah, that's helpful. We're going to get into some adoption wave stuff for sure because you've got a great vantage point for it. I want to drill more into the happy path analogy that you've highlighted. One of the things that's really interesting is the cost of infrastructure has gone down dramatically, but other costs associated with enterprise application deployment, value capture has remained constant or even increased. Talking about app dev, like you and I've seen you talk about this. Talk a little bit more about the systems dynamic model of enterprise IT.
I would be delighted to. So the two biggest drivers of cost in any enterprise IT organization are application development and maintenance and infrastructure. And as you point out, I would suggest we've seen a massive decline in the unit cost of infrastructure in relation to functionality provided over the, roughly speaking, the last 25 years. I'm old enough to remember, and some of our new associates barely believe this, when we used to run, or large corporations used to run, a single relatively smallish application on a $50,000 server, using a RISC chip and a proprietary Unix operating system and what have you. That was expensive. And since then, we've had multiple waves of cost optimization. We had Linux, we had virtualization. More recently, we've had cloud. what have you. And now you have 10 fairly decently sized applications running on what might be a $7,000 server or a $10,000 server. So the hardware cost associated with running an application has gone down by a hell of a lot, and also we have much more automation in infrastructure. It's not perfect, but it's more than it used to be. And there's been no commensurate decrease in the unit cost of, for example, application development, right? And in fact, even though there's more tooling and what have you, in many respects, um, and this is hard to measure precisely because we don't have good volume metrics for application development in most places. But you could argue that the cost per unit of functionality of application development has gone up over the past 25 years. Why? Because we care a hell of a lot more about things like security and resiliency and regulatory compliance than we did 25 years ago. And that takes money to code. So at many institutions, the cost of application development or the cost of application engineering is a break or a rate limiting factor, not just on the IT organization, but on the business strategy as a whole, as people are thinking about how to digitize and how to drive an analytics agenda.
Yeah, I mean the cost of securing, hardening, making resilient applications at scale is definitely something that we've seen an increased demand for, which drives up the cost, like you're saying. And the other factor is the cost of the labor, the talent. Since
Yes.
there has been a shortage in talent for so long, the salaries of the actual engineers that are building it have soared.
Yeah, and I think a number of people are trying to sort out exactly what's happening with labor markets for engineering right now. It's, I would suggest, more confusing rather than less. But say as of 2 years ago, I knew many CIOs who'd say, "Gee, even if they let me spend more, application development is a still a rate limiting factor for the business for a couple of reasons. One, you know, even with high salaries, as of 2 years ago, people couldn't find the talent they needed, right? Because there's only so many people in the world. And then, second, it might take 9 months or a year for a new software engineer to be effective in the context of a complicated environment with lots of legacy and lots of dependencies between applications. Just one point I did want to make about how tough this is. I'm fond of saying that IT is easy and cheap. IT at scale, with resiliency, with performance, with security, compliant to relevant regulations, is expensive and hard. And often people don't get that, right? They say, "Oh, gee, I could code something up like this, and I did it in a couple of days." I'm like, "Okay, that's great, but now you have the next several months of making it into an enterprise grade service that can support 10,000 or 50,000 users."
Yeah, this is a great point. And talk, this has an impact on how companies deploy. Right, there was this mad dash for cloud deployments with the expectation of cost savings. Obviously, that's not exactly the case when you're moving to the cloud. What ramifications does this have on cloud migration?
Yeah, and cloud economics are somewhat complicated, I would suggest. I will say many people, including myself, first looked in cloud and just assumed it was like the next level of virtualization and the next generation of virtualization. Hey, we spend so much money on infrastructure, we'll move to the cloud, it'll be more automated, and we'll spend less money on infrastructure. And then two things turned out to be true. First of which is we forgot quite how much money we had already ripped out of infrastructure over the course of the past 25 years. Right? It's not like we're using $50,000 servers for a single application anymore. And then second, many people, myself included, failed to take into account the level of application change required to have an application run effectively, securely, um, efficiently in the cloud. So to take advantage of the cloud's cost benefits and scalability benefits, you need to support auto scaling, right?
Yeah, you're not running
In
just a monolithic MVC
exactly,
application stack. You're
exactly,
refactoring it. Yeah. So auto
and
scaling, keep going.
security very different in the cloud. You're much more dependent on granular configuration of the individual system and much less reliant on a perimeter because you're no longer inside the perimeter your data center had traditionally provided. So this created, I think, some really interesting economics around cloud.
So the research you're doing around AI, uh, are you seeing this translate into findings related to cloud?
I think what you find is that engineering productivity, software engineering productivity, is an incredibly important driver of many things, including your ability to migrate to the cloud, which then also further improves software engineering productivity because a well-architected system in the cloud is more productive, or you can be more productive managing and supporting a well-architected system in the cloud than a legacy system on-prem. And the thing that's exciting is we're starting to see early indications that Gen AI both improves engineering productivity and can accelerate the remediation of legacy applications to work well in the cloud. And at the simplest level, the interrogative aspects of Gen AI are very exciting because what do you do? What's the first step when you're remediating a legacy application? It's analysis, right? What are all the functions and what's the relationships between the functions and what's dependent on what? And that takes real time, especially if you're dealing with 30-year-old code and the people who wrote it are retired and the documentation was never very good. But you can now use Gen AI tools to interrogate that code base and create a level of transparency that would have taken you weeks or months to create by hand. And then on top of that, obviously, you can use Gen AI in refactoring at least certain elements of the code base to be more modern.
Yeah. So the central theory that you're beginning to see some evidence of, I'm assuming from your research, one of them is by increasing the productivity of software engineers through the use of Gen AI tools on things like being able to interrogate a legacy application, identify the specific patterns necessary to um, migrate it to the cloud. We're going to see an acceleration in cloud migrations. And then what's the net benefit to the enterprise?
It allows you, broadly speaking, not just in cloud, to escape as what we're starting to think of as the IT doom loop. Okay. So one of the reasons we launched at this research is we got to a really big debate internally about to what extent is IT creating economic value, right? Because there's, and you can, actually, I mean, the research on this is fascinating, right? Because as of the 1980s, it didn't look like IT was contributing much to productivity, at least in the US. Then you had this uptick in the 1990s that was very exciting in terms of labor productivity. And then shortly after the turn of the century, that uptick disappeared and labor productivity slowed, even though IT investment increased. And then recently, I want to say in the last year or two, it looks like we're having an uptick again. That's the first thing. The second thing, it's not clear whether William Gibson actually said the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed. But whether he said it or not, it's an incredibly important point, and it's, I think, becoming increasingly clear that the returns to IT are concentrated in a relatively small number of sectors and a relatively small number of companies. And I think one of the reasons that you've seen such um, super normal performance of technology companies in capital markets is that they're better able, as you would expect, to make use of technology, right? And so the question is, why has this been so tough for so many traditional enterprises? And we've been interviewing a lot of CIOs and CTOs about this. It's becoming clear that most business leaders forget about understanding the technology of technology, don't understand the economics of technology. They don't understand the cost of complexity. They don't understand the cost of risk. And this drives a series of dysfunctional decisions, which result in effect, drives a lot of technical debt, which means that many IT shops are sort of just treading water to support a BAU activity and don't have the time and resources to invest in innovation and support in changing the business.
What's BAU?
Business as
Activity.
usual. Excuse me.
Oh, business as usual. Okay, gotcha.
Sorry about that. Yes, you should fine me $1 every time I commit a jargon sin.
Hey, it was the first
Right?
time. It's all right. It's no problem.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. And it's the doom loop is especially interesting because I've seen this dynamic again and again over decades, literally, which is IT is not funded appropriately to invest in innovation. Some new thing comes out, cloud, AI, Gen AI, CRM, whatever it is. Business leaders perceive IT as unresponsive, correctly, right? Because they're too busy dealing with, they're struggling to stay on top of business as usual. They go sometimes and create shadow IT, do it themselves or just do it with a vendor. After a couple of years, this starts to feel expensive or risky. They throw whatever the system is over the wall in terms of IT, over the wall to IT. IT has an even bigger legacy base to support and even less discretionary funding to support innovation. So when the next thing comes up, the business says, "Oh, gee, we have to do this ourselves," understandably, or we have to just get a third-party vendor to do it. And then 2 years later, that gets thrown into IT. So you get this bigger and bigger legacy base. You get more and more technical debt. And the IT organization, enterprise technology organization, becomes more and more overwhelmed managing business as usual. And there's less and less space for investment in innovation and changing the business.
And that's the IT doom loop that you just described there.
Exactly so. So the question is, how do you get out of the doom loop?
The thing that's interesting to me is, I don't know if you've ever read David Graeber. He was an anthropologist at Oxford University. He wrote
I have not.
Jobs. Yeah, he wrote Bullshit Jobs.
I've heard about the book. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, he's also the guy who started the Occupy movement. So he's an anarchist. But
okay.
He's a great thinker, though. He genuinely is. And he wrote an article on Bullshit Jobs. You could just read the article and get the gist of the entire book. But
yeah, I think I've read a review of the book or what have you.
Yeah, but this idea that people genuinely, I'll use my own words. These aren't Graeber's, but people genuinely they have the best of intentions. Humans are altruistic, generally speaking, and they have the best of intentions. So let's say that the statement you made about, well, maybe technology is better at capitalizing on the productivity gains of technology, and I don't know if that's true. My assertion would be that technology is more willing to disrupt itself. It is less willing to execute with business as usual. Just to wrap up the assertion is I would argue that it is possible. Okay, this is a controversial statement, that technology is probably better at disrupting itself than traditional legacy other industries.
Yeah, I'm sure that's right. And maybe we're saying similar things in different ways. like let's take product operating model as an example. I think at this point we can say a product operating model where everything in technology is a product, everything in technology is a P&L. You have a powered product owner for each technology product. You have service levels for each technology product. You try to make each product as autonomous as possible with clearly defined service contracts with lower level of products. So not everything requires getting 50 people on a conference call. I think there's at this point good evidence that it's just a fundamentally better way, as an example, to run a technology platform or a technology environment. And there's been a lot of progress on the part of many enterprises in moving to a product operating model. I don't think they've been anywhere near, though, as rigorous about it or as fanatical about it as technology organizations have been, or technology companies in the technology sector.
Because that's like an important point you were driving at, which was around productivity gains and how the product operating model in technology makes it. I think what the point you were making is it makes it simpler and easier to understand because you've got like this
Okay,
distributed, loosely coupled microservice model around product unit groups,
yeah.
and it's
Well,
pretty clean.
yeah,
But go on.
let me put it this way. Um, Here is one of the conceptual changes that I think business leaders need to undertake in order for their company to succeed in the future in terms of getting value from technology. No longer thinking about IT as G&A, but thinking about it as COGS. It's not a fixed overhead cost. It's a variable cost driven by the amount of activity. So, for example, we ran a let's say we ran a auto company, right? And let's say that our manufacturing costs went up 10% in a year. Is that good or bad? Total, not unit costs, total costs.
Yeah, if your manufacturing costs went up by 10%, that seems like that would be bad.
Not necessarily. It could be very good. What
Tell me
if you
how.
what if you made 12% more cars and sold
Oh yeah,
12% more cars?
sure.
Well, that's exactly my
So
point.
not
I
the
said
per
total
unit manufacturer
Yeah,
cost, just
not the
the
per unit,
overall. Gotcha.
the total cost, right? I mean, if you're an auto company and you sold 12% more cars, and your manufacturing costs went up in aggregate 10%, everybody be throwing a party. Hey,
Yeah,
we're
yeah.
taking market share, and what's more, we're getting some operating leverage because if our revenues went up 12% and our total manufacturing costs went up 10%, we're getting a little bit more scale. This feels good, right? However, in many cases in IT, transaction volume goes up, level of automation goes up, sometimes revenues go up, right? Um, and as a result, IT costs up. But let's go. But oh my God, IT costs went up. Well, why did IT costs go up? Did they go up because IT is less efficient, or did they go up because the institution was asking more of IT?
Yeah, this is a good point. And it's like your point about like, hey, is it G&A, is it COGS? Well, presumably the IT function is supporting the productivity of the overall company. So isn't that a cost of goods sold?
Exactly.
In your research around AI that you're doing, is there any findings that you've seen so far that are unexpected or perhaps related to what we're talking about here?
Yeah, it's a little bit, and we're still digging into this a little bit. But you take banking as an example. Okay, would you use a bank that did not have a mobile banking application?
No.
Okay, so mobile banking is good, right? And it's important for banks to have. There is at least some research. I think the FDIC released a paper that says, in aggregate, mobile banking has destroyed value for the banking industry because it increases competition and it breaks down some local monopolies and what have you. So if mobile banking destroys value for banks at the margin, not a ton, but at least a little bit, does that mean that banks should no longer invest in mobile banking platforms?
Yeah, that's ridiculous. Obviously, like you just lose customers.
Exactly my point. And there's many things you have to do just because the market demands it that may look like they're non-accretive, but the alternative would be very painful.
Companies who are stuck in the IT doom loop, doing business as usual, who are reacting to the market, like the customer demand, often fail to see the larger picture where IT can create uh, generative value rather than being stuck in the same cycle of, like, the mobile banking, for a perfect example. It's like, okay, well, the cost of transactions are going up, the value of transactions are going down, and we're stuck in this IT doom loop of addressing this without thinking um, at a macro level with, okay, wait a second, what is the way that we take advantage of this and creating real generative value for the business through the use of technology?
You're managing to stay in the business, but you're only managing to stay in the business, at least from a technology standpoint. Obviously, in some cases, people will have other moats that allow them to capture value, whether it's product or privileged customer relations or what have you. But they're not creating value with technology.
You're managing to stay in a business that is rapidly turning into a race to the bottom.
In some cases, yes.
Yeah, and or
In
like,
some
hey,
cases,
some of
yes.
your former, some of your core businesses, which are being disrupted by, let's say, fintech plays that have less
Yeah, exactly.
overhead. You're stuck in a race to the bottom, which you want to stay in that business, but unless you can come up with a disruptive way to have that business as a component of something that's actually a growth business that's generating revenue, you're going to have a Pyrrhic victory because you may stay in the business, but it's gonna drag down your margins and potentially damage your organization entirely.
Yeah, because the place you don't want to be is your legacy institution who has, say, an IT metabolism of 50. You're competing against an attacker who maybe has an IT metabolism of 100, and technology is important to customer value propositions in the space, and you don't have some other moat. Man, that's sort of a scary place to be.
So you just came up with a really good analogy about uh, legacy, or maybe legacy is the wrong word, mature enterprise scale businesses that have the potential of being disrupted by up and comers. Let's taking financial services industry, right? These are very mature, very innovative companies that have been around for many years, but their risk in the description you just described is that IT doom loop of chasing a business to the bottom because they're being disrupted by a fintech startup, right? And the analogy you came up with was the IT metabolism, or let's call it an innovation metabolism differential between them. How does AI change that? Does it change that?
Um, yes. I mean, I would say it both increases the importance of changing it and makes it more possible to change it. Yeah, so sometimes I talk about what Gen AI for the business versus Gen AI for IT. So when we say Gen AI for the business, all the things, all the new use cases, or all the new sources of value, and as a result of Gen AI, the pool of potential economic profit is expanding. Right? We can debate, how many hundreds of billions of dollars it is, but it's not small, right? Now, if the pool of potential economic value is expanding, that makes it even worse to have a slower innovation metabolism than your competitors or even your suppliers or customers, because you compete for share with competitors. You also compete for value with suppliers and customers. right? Um, Now we we it is becoming more apparent to us, and I admit our research is still in process, that there's a set of actions that existing enterprises can take based on the learnings from companies with higher innovation metabolisms that will allow them to compete for value more effectively. That is, to run their technology organizations in such a way that will increase their innovation metabolism and get more value from Gen AI, as well as get more value from other types of technology investments. And those things will converge. It's not like we'll have Gen AI set of activities over here and an other AI set of activities over there. The systems will converge. We'll get Gen AI built into a wide variety of business applications and business systems.
It totally makes sense. The thing that I wonder is, we're seeing this adoption curve of AI, or a maturity curve, adoption curve. It's kind of the same thing. They kind of go hand in hand, which is, there's the AI sandbox. I'm doing some experimentation. I've got some pilots up and running. I'm doing some interesting, nifty things that seem to be very high value. The next phase, AI, what I call plateau, is, oh, I've moved that pilot into production. And generally, what happens, and I'll say plateau for this reason, is the data that I was using as part of that sandbox, I can't use into production, because it's got, like, it's the highest value data is the most sensitive data.
Right.
And in
Yeah.
a moment, I'm going to tie this back to the innovation metabolism, but
I
bear
think
with
you're
me for a
exactly
moment.
right, because I think the two concepts are related.
Yeah. And then the third wave generally is, okay, this is the AI powerhouse. I figured out how to ensure and create guarantees around privacy and security. Um, that's when the powerhouse hits. I'm going to call back to a couple of concepts you touched upon. One of the things you said was IT is cheap until you try to put it into scale. AI is even cheaper, right? It is so much cheaper to get some kind of automation up and running with AI, as long as you don't care about the underlying data leaking, the privacy, the security, the regulatory overhead. So, going back to the innovation metabolism of a mature financial services organization versus an up and coming fintech company, how are those mature ones going to compete with the up and coming? Because the up and coming, they're pirates.
They don't have the level of complexity to deal with, right? Um, the I would divide maybe your powerhouse into two phases, right? The first of which is getting a few pilots into production, and people can do that, right? You want to get 5 use cases done. You sort of get the security and compliance right via brute force. But if you're a bank or a manufacturing company or anyone else, or a pharma company with $50 billion in revenue, 5 use cases does not move the share price, most
Yeah,
likely,
being
unless
able to query, having a conversation with your HR policies probably is not going to move the needle.
even the very, in many cases, even the highest impact single use case is only going, when you think about, you got 40 different businesses, each business has multiple business functions. Even a single use case is only going to move the economics of the institution so much, or even 5 use cases. All right. You're going to need hundreds of use cases when you think about the full range of businesses and functions. And yeah, you can brute force 5 use cases. You can't brute force 150. So I think that's the point where you need, or, not that's the point, from the point at which you're thinking about the initial use cases, you need to be thinking about the scalable IT doctrine, IT operating model that allows you to increase the metabolism of the institution and execute on Gen AI as well as other types of value creating opportunities at scale. And sometimes, we were just debating this the other day, you were talking about an E-shaped model for adopting things like Gen AI, because some people say, don't worry about the cross-cutting capabilities. Let's just figure out use cases first. I'm like, okay, that's great, but that doesn't scale. Then other people say, we got to figure out all the capabilities that allow us to scale first. Well, that doesn't excite business leaders very much. A and B, it's sort of hard to figure out what the horizontal capabilities are in the absence of a few use cases. So I think you need to proceed along two axes. You need to build a few use cases early and start on the horizontal capabilities and use the learnings from the use cases to get the horizontal capabilities right. And then accept that, probably for your first few use cases, you may need to go back and retrofit them to take advantage of capabilities you learned that you needed as you developed your technology transformation.
So here's what I'm hearing you say. In order for enterprises to get value out of AI, they have to think across business units. Because if you just do a use case within a singular given business unit, that's not going to generate a whole lot of value. The important thing that you say about that drives home for me something that I've been saying, and I think is pretty well recognized as doctrine, is it's about the data. So if you're operating within a singular silo within an organization, the value is going to be pretty limited. If you can span that across multiple silos within an organization or departmental or functions or business units, you're going to see potentially orders of magnitudes of increase as you can scale it across those business units. The challenge with that is that you have to have the foundation in place of a platform in order for you to be able to ensure that, hey, are we actually applying the appropriate access controls or privacy or governance and compliance? And it gets far more complex.
And even just connecting the dots. You need the platform to help you connect the dots across different use cases in different businesses.
Yeah. So the thing that you're describing here is like, well, in the enterprise, you've had this idea that, hey, we're just going to go do a quick sandbox around a business unit and do some use cases in here. Or you have the opposite of opinion, which is no, we've got to build the platform for it first, and we'll come back in 2 or 3 years, estimated, which is going to slip. Once the platform's completed, and then you can start deploying your use cases. Of course, the problem with that is if you're focusing on building the platform independent of the use cases, it's I went up to the mountain, I came back with 15, no, 10 tablet, right? The years later, you've completely missed the point, and you probably didn't build a platform that serves the use cases. So your point around the E model is, look, you've got to be building the platform with a handful of cross-functional or cross-business use cases that are of significant value to be differentiated. And that's the E. There's the vertical line that's the platform, and then the horizontal lines that are the individual use cases.
Yeah. I would have tilted the E on the side, with the verticals being the use cases and the horizontals being the platform and the operating model, because I think you
Wait, I
need
got
to
to see
put
what
both
this
things
E looks
together.
like. It's a
It's
sideways
a
E.
sideways E.
Okay.
All right. Would it be okay if I talked a little bit about what the principles of this future state operating model or this doctrine need to be? Because
Yeah,
I
that's
spent a lot of
excellent.
time thinking about that.
I'd love
And
to hear
we're
this.
yeah. So the first of which is, we talked about the operating model. So building a mature, comprehensive product operating model that forces transparency into cost, value, and risk in terms of decision making. Second, you know, building security compliance into everything you do, in effect shifting left on security and compliance. Third, doing platform as code, or actually everything as code. So not only are you building products, not only are you building common platforms, but you're describing both your products and your platforms as code. You are creating a talent model which leverages, quite frankly, much higher talent people and enables them to be artisans and supports them with a highly automated ML dev sec ops type of capability. And it's redesigning the vendor strategy to take into account the vastly different economics that Gen AI creates. For example, this might mean if your cost of engineering is lower, you are shifting the mix of procured versus internally developed applications, right? You might think about, and then finally, connecting all your data using knowledge graphs. And sometimes I'm fond of saying, we've talked a lot about Gen AI in this call, but I actually think Gen AI is only half the story. It's actually Gen AI plus knowledge graphs. And even when we help people use Gen AI to interrogate legacy code bases, what we're doing underneath the covers is generating a graph that describes the code base. And I think that gets applied to almost everything IT does, because there's so many things that you can model more effectively with a graph than you could model with a traditional relational database. And that allows you to do things that are more representative of both the IT and the business model, and it also allows you to connect disparate data sets. And then on top of that, if you use Gen AI to interrogate data, that allows you to take unstructured data and suck it into a knowledge graph for a type of insight that had not been possible previously.
Okay, the second one is the one I want to drill into selfishly
Okay.
because of opaque.
Please.
The second one is around having a security and compliance as a foundational component into everything that you do. And drill into that about why that's so necessary for scale. Like this goes back to what you're saying at the beginning, where it's like IT is cheap until you put it in scale. Like IT is cheap until you actually make it something that delivers value. By virtue of it delivering value, there's significant more risk associated with that because there's high quality data. There's differentiated value in the data. It's proprietary data. It needs to be kept private. There's regulatory requirements. Let's drill into that one.
Here's my favorite cloud security story. Years ago, an institution I knew of their thousands of applications, they had 4 in the cloud. 1, 2, 3, 4. Not 4%, 4. Right? And I'd assumed it was a very security conscious organization. And I was actually, if you'd asked me to bet on it, I would have said, gee, I bet these 4 applications are pretty secure because they're the first 4 things they put in the cloud. And I was guessing a fairly senior architect went over that system configuration in a pretty granular way. And then I said, gee, if you want to get from 4 to 400 applications in the cloud, then it's very different because you can't do that. As it turned out, they had problems with those 4 applications. And the reason is that, while it's hard to technically compromise underlying cloud services, and they're probably certainly more secure than underlying technologies that you might have on-prem, getting the configuration right from a security standpoint in the cloud is very tough. And I would say almost all the cloud breaches we know of are the result of misconfiguration. So in order to get security and compliance right, you need to define your policies as code. Here are the things that need to run on, need to be encrypted at motion, encrypted at rest, require 2-factor authentication, need to run in need to be secured down to the chip level, what have you. So you can then use, a cloud security posture management type capability to ensure that anything you provision into a production environment matches your policies and does not drift, and that you prevent drift over time.
Definitely. If we map that back to the AI phases, it's like there's sandbox pilot, There's plateau. Okay, I moved it into production. I couldn't use the data I wanted. There's powerhouse, which is okay, in order to do this, I have to create some foundational security, compliance, privacy guarantees. Or I just can't use the data because in the event that that data leaks, like we were talking about earlier, the fact is if that data leaks with AI, competitors may come and disrupt me. There's all new manner of ways to be disrupted when you leak data, and there's also regulatory reasons, of course.
And let's face it, it's the whole confidentiality, integrity, availability triad. It's not just the confidentiality of data. You also need to think about the availability of the system and the integrity of the business process. And any of the three could be at risk if you're not ready to enter, quote unquote, the powerhouse in
Yeah,
terms of
the E
scalability.
model. I have seen myself that we see two things. We see there's companies who will build without the guarantees in the first phase, and then they have to go and refactor everything because they didn't build the underlying platform, right? They delivered on some use cases that were super low value within a department, within a business unit. I can talk to my HR policies. It's something that is cute but not valuable. And the reason why they couldn't deliver the value is they didn't focus on this E model that you're describing, which is, hey, I need to provide the foundational guarantees around privacy in order for me to be able to deliver differentiated value, because the only way to do that is with my sensitive data. So your E model ties in perfectly, where it's like you need to be doing this foundational work while focusing on some key use cases, even if those key use cases are not the most sensitive, because otherwise you have to go back and refactor everything. Which you're proposing is you go back and refactor some of the use cases, but the foundational components been built around those use cases. And the refactoring of those use cases may be, hey, now I'm using the most sensitive data.
And the only nuance I would add is if you're doing one use case with sensitive data, it's at least theoretically possible you could sort of hand tune that to be safe. With 100 use cases, not even theoretically possible.
Right. Right. Yeah. I really like this E model. You had a podcast that you were on. It was in October, it was the Autopilot podcast. And the host asked your opinion on,
Yeah, Will Summerlin, he's a riot.
he asked you about the enterprise adoption cycle, like where are the enterprise, and you had this baseball term you mentioned at the top too. Talk a little bit about that, and then a lot's happened in 6 months, right? That was six
Yeah, I
months
mean,
ago.
maybe I'm being overly flip and saying that we haven't even the first pitch hasn't been thrown. Maybe the first batter's in the box, right? But yeah, at the end of the day, people are still, I think, experimenting, right? There's a million uncertainties, right? In financial services, there's a lot of thinking about, okay, what's okay from a regulatory standpoint and what isn't, right? Within IT, it's still very early days in most cases. And for example, um, I know a number of places where they're using sort of code assistance, but not doing more than that, right? Which is, they're providing some sort of Gen AI tooling that allows people to say, oh, gee, I want to write a function that does X, Y, and Z. And it comes back and, says, oh, gee, you can write the code like this, right? Well, that's maybe a 5 or 10% productivity improvement. That's not the 40 or 50% productivity improvement you get when you sort of redesign the entire software development lifecycle to leverage Gen AI.
Yeah, agreed. And there's also great companies like ServiceNow, who's an opaque customer, and I actually worked at ServiceNow, who are offering some AI features inside their product that are being adopted. But these may give you incremental productivity gains, but it's not redefining your business, which all companies have to do with AI. If they're not reinventing their business with AI, using the proprietary data they have at their disposal, they're going to get disrupted.
Yeah, one of the my favorite books that I've read this year is called "Technology and the Rise of Great Powers" by Jeffrey Ding, who's a economist, I believe, at George Washington University, and he describes Gen AI as a what's called a GPT, a general purpose technology, which means that it many other things can be built on top of it, and previous general purpose technologies like ironworking and so forth, sparked additional phases or phases of the industrial revolution. But his point is, in previous phases, so for example, it took a long time for the full impact of the innovations underneath the second industrial revolution in the second half of the 19th century to have full economic impact. Why? Because companies needed to redesign their factories and their business models around things like electricity and interchangeable parts and so forth. And that is a process that took decades. Hopefully, it won't take hopefully we operate faster, so it'll take years rather than decades. But that is not a trivial task. The other thing he said that was really interesting, he was able to demonstrate in the past that distinctive value accrued to the companies and the countries that could best apply um, general purpose technologies rather than companies and countries that engaged in the base level innovation. And I think he used the metaphor that obviously chemicals were incredibly important to the second industrial revolution, and all the best chemists in the world were in Germany, but the United States invented the discipline of chemical engineering, which was incredibly helpful, which is more of an applied science and less of a theoretical science, and was incredibly helpful to the development and massive scaling of the chemical industry in the United States in the second half of in the late 19th century.
That sounds like a great book. I'll read it.
It is fantastic. It's a quick read.
The thing that I think about with AI being so transformative is the use of generative AI is going to have a massive effect on swinging the pendulum back to decentralized market dynamics in multiple industries. I suspect we'll see it in software, for example. We're going to see it in many places, though. The examples that obviously it democratizes the ability to like build and ship products or innovate products. But the other thing that's really critical about this is the ability to take advantage of data. So if I'm a enterprise scale company, I have data within my organization that can be used to completely disrupt my business if I'm using AI, or launch entirely new products. So my supply chain partners, should they get access to my data, could completely disrupt my business. My distribution partners, should they get access to my data, can completely disrupt my business.
Mm-hmm.
So
because you're not only competing for value with your competitors, you also compete for value with your suppliers and your customers.
And with AI, you can interrogate that data and you could come up with all manner of business disruption if it should leak. And it goes back to what you were saying on that same Autopilot podcast. You were talking about most institutions are sitting on top of an endless ocean of unstructured text and semi-structured data. It was very difficult for companies to take advantage of that before generative AI. Now it's actually quite easy for companies to take advantage of that, or your competitors to take advantage of that.
Yeah, I would say possible, not easy, but yes.
Comparatively speaking,
comparatively easy, yes.
Yeah, and what we see a lot of at Opaque is companies who want to benefit from that data, like as part of a confidential RAG or a RAG pipeline, right? They're like, oh, we're going to pull it in, we're going to use it as context. We're seeing that it's not necessary to fine tune models, which is expensive. You can just do it as part of a RAG pipeline, or so. Who knows what RAG will look like? We're going to get to knowledge graphs here in a second for sure. But the challenge with that is we're seeing that a lot of these RAG pipelines are auto-generating SQL queries as part of a multi-agent system. Those SQL queries are calling these back office systems or pulling in unstructured and semi-structured data. Could be SQL queries, could be other types of queries, right? And that's being used in the context of these RAG pipelines. So For opaque, one of the things that we're getting a ton of traction with companies around is a confidential RAG pipeline that we can run the data and with guarantees around privacy and access control
End to
policies,
end, I
end
imagine.
to end, including
Right.
during the compute. Exactly.
Yeah.
So there's just so much uncertainty if you're not using something that's giving you those guarantees, you're undoubtedly going to get disrupted, exactly like you said earlier on in this, which this was all a callback to multiple things, which was one, the unstructured and structured data you brought up earlier. Two, the value capture happens with your supply chain and your distribution partners. We're going to see acceleration of that with AI. And then I think another key thing is, well, what are you seeing? You've already touched on it around how organizations at enterprise scale are organizing that information to capitalize on it, which you've already, knowledge graphs, talk more about that. Like, why knowledge graph, not vector databases?
I can't prove this. This is a belief, not something I can demonstrate just yet. Is the winners of the future will be those organizations with the best graphs. Here is why I think that we'll see a lot more in the way of enterprise graphs in the future. So, okay, let's think about a relational database. Phenomenal for transactional data, credit card authorizations in a single business. Much less good when when you have ambiguous data, where you have unstructured data, where you need to federate data across multiple businesses. Here's why I got so excited about knowledge graphs and their application in the enterprise. First of which is you don't have to get as much of the schema right up front. It's more flexible, right? And you can have different levels of granularity at in different parts of the graph without creating a sparse matrix, right? And as anyone who's gotten halfway into something and said, "Oh my God, maybe we got the data schema wrong," will appreciate that. That's the first thing. Second thing is, ironically, relationships are um, a first-class citizen of a graph in a way they're not in a relational database. So in a graph, you can attach properties to relationships. You can not only say, I'm a node, you're a node, and there's an edge between us that says we have some sort of relationship. We can say, how well do that implies we know each other, but you can say, how well do we know each other, right? How long have we known each other? That type of thing, right? Which is actually sort of pretty useful when much of when in a world where connections among things will be increasingly important in the future. And third is knowledge graphs are actually pretty easy to explain to business leaders, right? In fact, if you were to describe, customers or products or what have you, or the relationships between products and customers to a business leader who is not very technically sophisticated, what you would draw on the whiteboard might not look that different from what's in the graph. And then finally, I would note, if you look at several of the companies that were quote unquote born digital that have disproportionate capital market performance over the past decade, many of them are built on top of knowledge graphs. Why? Because it's a really good way of managing massive data sets and understanding the relationships among different pieces of data. And because they were born digital, they had much less unstructured, they were able to capture a much higher percentage of all the data relevant to the enterprise.
This should be for the less technical listener, although I don't know that we have many of those. The knowledge graph is a structure for organizing and retrieving information that looks a lot like how you do it in your own brain.
Exactly so, which is why business users could understand it. And think of it as, instead of your data being organized into rows and columns in a table and looking like Excel for a spreadsheet, for want of a better term.
That is not how we organize information in our brain.
That's not how we are. It's also not how the world exists in real life. A knowledge graph, has nodes like, I might be a node, Aaron might be a node, opaque might be a node, what have you, and edges that describe relationships between nodes. And both nodes and edges can have labels or properties.
Yeah, absolutely. So there was a LinkedIn post that piqued my interest about your skepticism for small language models, and I'm curious
Yeah,
because I have an opinion on this one, but I want to hear your thoughts on this.
I was historically skeptical. I'm less skeptical now, to be honest. So when I made that post, I suppose my hypothesis had been um, that that it was just what we would see is a small number of massively scaled large language models, and those would be generally applicable. But I think now there's at least more data points that indicate that there will be room in the ecosystem around highly focused small language models. And so, for example, there is one sort of attacker clinical service provider in the healthcare space. I was chatting with actually somebody I met on a plane about it, and they have a series of treatment protocols that they've created that are bespoke to them and they feel really good about, and they used RAG to ingest them into their systems, right? And want to use that to sort of to sort of monitor the activities of various practitioners, and they've been struggling a little bit with most of the time. Um, the Gen AI application leverages the bespoke treatment protocols they created, but every now and again it'll go leverage something that's that was published in the 1990s that's out of date. So I think for highly professional, highly specialized use cases where you really want to guarantee that you're deriving insights from the most current and the highest quality data sources, you may see more in the way of small language models.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the idea. Like I see what IBM's doing with their Granite model family, and they've said, okay, look, there's going to be these frontier model developers that are developing very large language models that are going to be much more general purpose. We're going to get really good at developing highly specialized small language models that can be used, and they're also like truly open sourcing them. Like here's the data, here's the procedures, here's the weights, everything's completely open sourced. So we'll see people, I'm sure, that may fine tune those with their own specialized data sets. But also, I think we're going to see a lot of people just using them inside their RAG pipelines, and or I use that term pretty loosely inside their agentic workflows, because increasingly what we see is companies are willing to route less sensitive workloads to these foundation models where they're sending data and processing them in the clear, but increasingly for their most sensitive data they're running it confidentially. So they're running inside of a confidential agentic workflow that includes the RAG. They're pulling in information. They're running it with small language models or open source models.
Yeah, I think what's going to happen. I mean, we're such early days, and nobody has figured out the architecture yet. And I think we're going to see a lot of really interesting experimentation with different architectures for different types of use cases, and stuff will shake out over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. And what I'd say would be a really exciting way, right? This is how the state of the art evolves or advances.
Yeah, and I think it's safe to say that knowledge graphs are going to play a foundational role, and RAG
I'm
rather
pretty
than
sure of that.
training. Yeah, I completely agree. So we've got our salon coming up in I guess the time that this drops. So there's no point in promoting it, but I'm excited to hear even more of your research at the AI salon in Manhattan that we're doing. We'll be talking about scaling AI while maintaining security, privacy, compliance, foundation. This whole concept of the E that you're describing, I think, is a really useful one. I think I might steal it, although I don't know that I'll use an
Nothing.
upside down
I
E,
didn't. I
sideways
don't think
E.
I came up with it. I don't think I came up with the sideways E.
But I think it's a great one, and I'm really excited to get the full research. Oh, and also I should mention you're keynoting the Confidential Computing Summit that we host in San Francisco in June.
I look forward to it.
The Confidential Computing Summit in San Francisco. You're in great company. We have the CTO of Microsoft Azure, Mark Rusinovich. He's also the deputy CISO. We have the chief security officer from NVIDIA keynoting. It's an amazing lineup. Also including you, of course, in the amazing lineup. It's going to be terrific. We're really happy that you're willing to come out and share the stage with us.
I hope I'm sufficiently interesting. That's August company.
I'm sure that you will be. I'm sure. Well, James, thank you so much for all of your time today. It's been a lot of fun wandering through the woods of the enterprise IT landscape with you.
Enterprise IT dysfunction, Gen AI, software engineering productivity, knowledge graphs, and technology value. Some of my favorite things to talk about.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
As did I.
So the thing that stood out for me, Mark, was he was talking about that the cost of moving to cloud your legacy applications had kind of like all of the cloud migration that was going to happen and happened because the cost of migration was too high. The cost of infrastructure has dropped tremendously, right? It's like a race to zero, to the extent that it's not even the infrastructure costs. The cost of labor associated with refactoring the legacy applications that weren't designed to be cloud native is where the cost is. And that's a labor cost of developers. So with AI, his thesis is you can interrogate legacy applications and then make it easier to port them to cloud.
Interesting. I'm assuming he sees this up close a lot more than we do, because the thing that's I find interesting is it's really easy now to create software, but it's really hard for AI to implement a scalable design pattern. So think about something that requires failover or multi-zone, or using something like Anycast for applications, because there's not a lot of, there is some, but the design patterns for these complex applications don't exist. But I mean, my takeaway from this episode has really been around, not what we can do more efficiently, but what we can do more of that we're not doing today, or do, it's the opportunity cost that we're not capitalizing on in general has been, think about deploying applications. Everybody deploys an application and tests it and puts it in production, thinking that someday they could maybe performance tune it or make it better somehow. And I would bet that 9 times out of 10, we never touch that code until there's a problem or a forced update. And I think that's my big takeaway these days is, what aren't we doing that we would like to do because it would provide some value, but because of, as you said, labor costs or other restrictions, AI can sort of accelerate or increase opportunities.
Yeah, I liked what James was saying about IT is cheap, but deploying IT at scale, ensuring security, resiliency, etc., is expensive. And I suspect, although we haven't yet seen this, that AI can assist with that, right? I believe as these AI coding tools improve, because it's able to understand the appropriate patterns for deploying, like in the cloud, for example, that it's going to optimize people's ability to deliver scalable, secure, resilient systems. And for sure, his point is correct about, well, being able to interrogate a legacy system in terms of what are its functions, what are its APIs, what APIs does it need to be, will provide a design pattern that gets you part of the way there and mapping it to the cloud. But that second part of, okay, well, how do you architect it for the cloud? I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah, I don't think so either. And I think that we'll start seeing these sort of design patterns coming from places where our vendors like a ServiceNow, a Datadog will have access to monitoring, performance monitoring, tracing, observability. I think it's like that's where that data the interrogation will happen is it'll start, doing things like mapping ports in security. It'll find, security scanners and use that data set. I don't know that individual companies will have enough data unless you're like a, Fortune 1000 maybe.
If you want to learn more about how to use AI responsibly, visit us at opaque.co. If you like the podcast, give us a review, a rating, wherever you get a podcast. And genuinely, we want your feedback. We want to hear from you. So give us a shout out in the review, or just email Mark or I directly. This episode of AI Confidential was produced by Wolverton Media Solutions, Places Media, Kodiak's Media, and Opaque. I love how this list is getting longer. Oh, and also the song and incidental music that was used in the podcast is by my buddy Matt Melamuka from Peaks Bend. And I'm Aaron Fulkerson.
And I'm Mark Hinkle. We'll see you next time. And you can keep in touch with me by subscribing to my newsletters at theaie.net, or come to one of my live events in Durham, North Carolina, where we have pimento cheese and high tech. See you next time.
I recommend both Mark's newsletter and pimento cheese. I believe there might be a mariachi band outside my office. Do you want to hear my actual radio voice?
Sure.
This is my radio voice.
I've long admired, that sort of mid-Atlantic accent that the radio announcers from the 40s had. The old-timey Hollywood voice.
He's coming up.
Yes, that. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Surprise,
surprise, surprise. Wait, I'm going to look in the camera when I do it. Hello, world. I forgot what I was supposed to say.
Can we do the Scooby-Doo outro like they did in Wayne's World?
Zoinks!
Doodle. You need to get a cloud lifter.
Cloud lifter.